Hello, I welcome you to the Psychology of Global Crises Conference. This is the keynote address of Professor Michel Ferrari. I am Maria Medved, Professor of Psychology at the American University of Paris and one of the co-organizers of this event. I will be moderating this session. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Michel Ferrari. Michel was a junior professor just starting out the year I obtained my PhD. So he always felt to me like the professor you could always really talk to. Michel Ferrari is professor of applied psychology and human development at the University of Toronto. His area of focus is on personal identity and how it develops in typical and atypical populations. This interest extends to questions of personal wisdom and to the development of academic and professional expertise. He has published widely on the topic of personal wisdom in people of different ages, from children to adults and the elderly in different countries all around the world. Before we continue, I would just like to thank Tim Munster, the student volunteer who is behind the scenes helping to moderate this talk. I would also like to remind you to use the question and answer function, not the chat function, if you have any questions for Michel after his talk. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Michel Ferrari, giving his talk entitled Coping Wisely to World Crises, Personally and Politically. Can it be done, and who can tell?
Thanks, Maria, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to you and Martin for inviting me to this amazing conference. I've just attended some of the other talks, and I'm just really amazed by the quality of them, but also the just the format. I'd say that lets people discuss, and I'm really looking forward to discussing with people after some of these preliminary ideas that I'm going to share with you today. So let me just get started and see that you'll notice that I've changed the title. I got rid of the who can tell, say, can it be done, and who can tell piece of it, because I'm not sure that that's something that I can answer, but at least maybe it's something we can discuss towards the end. All right, now I want to begin with a general sense of the goal that I'm going to be suggesting, something we should be striving for, to gain wisdom from experience. And wisdom means a lot of things. I'm going to come back to it later, but it's a generally positive, insightful, caring stance towards oneself and others. And now, how can you gain wisdom from experience? Well, of course, Julius Caesar famously said, experience is the teacher of all things. And so for some people, it's become a proverb, experience is the best teacher. That's sometimes true, but some experiences aren't like that. They provoke a crisis. It's not certain what we're going to learn from them. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a crisis as a vitally important or decisive stage in the progress of anything, a turning point in which a decisive change for better or worse is imminent. And it's the better or worse part, I think, that makes a crisis so unsettling. I mean, you might just take the stance of Nietzsche, who famously wrote in The Twilight of the Idols, out of the war school of life, what does not kill me makes me stronger. But is that true? I don't think we're all so certain. Whether we gain wisdom and strength or fall into despair in a crisis depends on how we respond to it. And I guess I'm going to talk about some ideas from psychology and how that might be encouraged. So then we could have a new goal, maybe something like post-crisis growth. How can we grow from a crisis? How can we nudge people towards wisdom and growth and away from fear and despair? Lawrence Calhoun and Richard Tedeschi and their students and colleagues have developed a model of post-traumatic growth. And the basic way it works is, well, I'll take an example of the COVID moment. So we're ourselves, we have differences, in how we respond to the world, the assumptions we make about the world, and of course, are culturally influenced. And then a disruptive event happens. There's the COVID-19 virus. And what that does is it challenges those basic beliefs and it distresses us. So for example, at the very fundamental level, it challenges the assumption that the world is safe unless there's a war. But I'm in Canada, nobody's coming to attack us. I'm in Toronto, it's a very safe city. My general sense is that the world is safe, but now suddenly I have to watch out for everybody I meet. Maybe they've got this virus. So, and that's going to disrupt the narratives that I have about the world, about the goals that I have, even in very small ways. Like I used to just walk into the shopping center, the grocery stores, buy groceries, and walk out. I mean, maybe wait a bit at checkout. Now I've got to line up 2 meters apart, and then the line sometimes goes halfway around the block, and it's a whole ordeal. The first time that happened, it was a shock. And these types of things get us to ruminate. We start to think about it. Sometimes even automatically it just comes back to your mind. How can this be possible? But we also start to analyze it. We talk to other people about it. And it's a way to manage the emotional distress. Of course, for some people, what I'm describing is very mild, but some people, I mean, have lost their jobs. They've lost their income. It's not sure that's coming back. So that's going to be really critically stressful. You need to find somebody to deal with it. How you deal with it will be influenced by proximal things like what kind of social support you have, what types of roles you got, what sort of models, say, that you have around you, even cultural models, religious models or philosophical models or simply cultural icons that you admire. Those are more distal, but they still can be immediate to us and important to us. And with all of that deliberate, reflective, constructive rumination, the more you really sort of think about it in a sort of careful way, you can revise your narrative. You can revise what's important. Maybe I'm not working as many hours in the day because I'm looking after my son, but I'm outside and I see him more. So there's things that also has an importance. Say that I can begin to shift my understanding of what my core values are. We're all healthy. So that becomes a core value. And we can accept that the world has changed. And what kind of resources and strengths and possibilities are available in this changed circumstance. And this more complex narrative in this model is what's meant by increased wisdom. And it should be associated with a better sense of well-being, greater life satisfaction. Now, more specifically, they define post-traumatic growth as positive psychological change experienced as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. Well, certainly the COVID-19 moment is going to be a paradigmatic case of something like that. And how will change be manifest? They found through extensive research that with these types of traumatic experiences, there are 5 aspects of life where you might see a change. A great appreciation of life itself. Like I said, we might just appreciate the fact that we are healthy, if we are. More intimate social relationships, greater feelings of personal strength, greater engagement with spiritual questions, and seeing new life possibilities. And of course, it doesn't happen automatically. It requires a certain stance towards these experiences, as I was just describing in their model. And as you saw from that model, it's really requires deriving meaning from the traumatic events, deliberate rumination about them, and the social support after self-disclosure to trusted, empathic others. Now, more comprehensive views taken up by people who are studying wisdom, say, as an experience that people have in their own lives. Judith Gluck in particular has championed this wisdom of experience paradigm, in which you ask people to think of moments in their life when they've been wise. And what she's developed out of that are certain attitudes that predispose us to develop wisdom from experience. Self-transformative experiences, they can be positive and negative. Sure, negative experience is something like this virus, but positive ones could be the birth of a child or starting a new relationship with someone that transform our sense of who we are and what possibilities our life affords us. Now, the 5 principles that she proposes are mastery experiences, which is to say knowing what you can do, but also knowing your limits and what's beyond your power, very much in the Stoic sense. Openness to experience in the first place, just to be open and willing to acknowledge experience, to reflect on that experience, but not just any kind of reflection. Nick Westrate and Judith Glück have identified exploratory processing, what they call sort of critically examining your experience, as opposed to redemptive reflection that's going to be about making yourself feel better, saying it's all going to be okay. I mean, that can be good actually at different moments, so we wouldn't want to totally discount it, but to gain wisdom, we really need to be able to confront our experience and learn from it. And that's also going to require emotional sensitivity and self-compassion towards ourselves, and empathy and compassion towards others. So we need to reimagine ourselves, but that necessarily includes a reimagining of society, as Molly Andrews said so wonderfully in her talk, and much more eloquently than I will. Now, how can we gain wisdom from this type of social reimagining, or how can we do so wisely? I think we can gain a lot from these guidelines on mental health and psychosocial support in emergency settings that was proposed by this interagency standing committee a few years ago. And I'm drawing particularly on the work of McGinn and Boothby in this, from a book that we did a few years ago. Emergency responses, in this view, should reduce risk and create opportunities at 4 levels: at the level of basic services and security, of community and family support, at focused non-specialized support, and specialized services like therapy. So the current pandemic certainly invites interventions at all these levels: emergency interventions like we're seeing right now, but also a reimagining of society after this the crisis has passed, that will promote human flourishing. So emergency support for basic services, we see things like, to weather the pandemic, political interventions that provide food, shelter, healthcare, salary replacement for people who have lost their jobs, in the hopes that those jobs will remain, say once the crisis has passed, food banks for people who are not able to get enough food, makeshift medical stations so hospitals aren't flooded, especially people who have the COVID-19 virus don't infect many others by going to emergency rooms, for example. We also find community and family support, so widespread communication through social networks and media about how to effectively cope with the virus or prevent its spread, especially advice for positive parenting under conditions of the pandemic, but also access to formal and informal educational opportunities. For example, here, the schools have switched to Zoom meetings or daily sort of web-based instruction in which the parents actually unfortunately have to take up a lot of the legwork, get our kids to do these assignments and then hand them in. But the idea is to provide some sort of a system so that we don't lose education, because that's been found to be a primary stressor for displaced and emergency affected families. And non-specialized support that are focused, especially for highly victimized groups. For example, we might think Asian minorities, we need to be careful, perhaps support them, especially these days if we have a narrative that the virus originally came from Asia, or those whose jobs are most severely affected by the pandemic in hotels or airlines, they might need special support. Beyond just psychosocial support, of course, they often include livelihood support to ensure that reinventing itself after these jobs, because they may not come back. So the kind of reinvention that's possible is one that within which people feel that they can grow, both psychologically, but also in terms of their social resources and their social well-being. And a few people with severe mental disorders might need psychological or psychiatric support wherever their needs exceed the capacities of the available general health services. They might need to be referred to specialized services, or longer-term training supervision of healthcare providers might be needed. And these are things that, we might expect to see an increase in the need for these services. So we need to consider, are we able to absorb this? Now, all this applies to the current pandemic, but also to other crises, like climate change or the refugee crisis, that are facing us in an ever more globalized world. to be prepared for the next crisis, we need to reimagine our societies and ourselves for the longer term. But how are we going to do that? Well, I'm not going to pretend to know the answer to that question. I'd like to just suggest a few things that seem to be worth discussing, and hopefully we can pick them up in the discussion that follows. And I'd like to orient us or frame this with a framework that Darshana Narvaez has developed, where she points out there are two main kinds of ethical orientations. One is protectionist, and that's where safety becomes the prime concern. You become vigilant. Self-distancing is a perfect example of this. You withdraw socially, or you might actually attack certain groups or oppose certain groups. You might like block certain people from coming. That's what you do immediately. You might also intentionally begin now to like control, say, who's able to like enter certain spaces, or you might become detached, intellectual, uncaring. And as you can imagine, these are not actually this is not a stance that will lead to greater flourishing. On the other hand, you can have a much more relational ethics in which you engage people. You try to attune, say, to their needs, co-construct a vision of reality that's of value to everybody, perhaps through self-sacrifice. Intentionally, you can plan sort of communally what sort of things we would like to see. And with a relational humanitarian perspective that tries to do the greatest good for the greatest number. It's fearless, but it's empathic, right? You need to sort of imagine what needs to be done and go ahead and set up these conditions. And I think we'll see that these are the kinds of things, both of these things are what are happening now in response to this pandemic. So the protectionist response we see in authoritarian societies like Hungary and the Philippines, using the pandemic to implement protectionist policies in the name of providing basic safety and security, but that involve arresting critics and summary executions sometimes, just things that are quite scary. And even in Canada and the United States, we find calls to close borders to immigrants or manufacture and buy essential products and produce so we don't have to rely on global networks. But we also find appeals to a relational response to help the most vulnerable members of society, the elderly, the frail, those in precarious employment, to free nonviolent prisoners so they're not trapped in prisons where the virus might spread, to share scientific data about the virus and work together to develop a vaccine. Generally to remain vigilant, certainly, but interconnected and in close communication so we can coordinate a global community response to the pandemic. So how can we tailor, sort of like tip things more towards this kind of relational response? And what would it look like? I think that Bhutan's efforts to develop and measure what they're calling gross national happiness is a really wonderful alternative way of envisioning what we might be trying to achieve. So of course, it's not as though economics are not important. The first pillar of their GNH is sustainable and equitable socioeconomic development. So you want to ensure adequate living conditions, health and education, but also to consider environmental conservation, sociocultural flourishing by promoting psychological well-being, community vitality, cultural resilience and diversity, and good governance through care of people, accountability, transparency. This all sounds very well, but someone's immediately going to say, how can that be done? And of course, it's not so simple, but we can at least have one wedge to begin to implement these types of changes through education reform. And I really love this quote from Adorno from the opening sentence of his Education After Auschwitz. The premier demand upon all education is that Auschwitz not happen again. And I think we could say something similar about this global pandemic. The premier demand upon all education is that a global pandemic not happen again. The schools can help achieve this by educating for wisdom. That's my claim. What's wisdom then, in this sense? Well, Osman gave a nice sort of survey of Western conceptions of wisdom and came up with 4 features that I think are a good target for, say, objective for our educational system. Breadth of knowledge, depth of knowledge, learning things that are difficult to access. So wise people know things that are inaccessible to ordinary people. This might include mystic or esoteric knowledge. But it might also be something that you find everywhere. It's just somewhat rare. And wholesomeness, expressed through maturity and character. People know what's practically good for themselves and for others, and how to live a good life. And of course, in some way, wisdom will always be people who excel in these dimensions. But the same way as literacy can be taken as a benchmark. And there are people who are exceptionally literate. They write books and poetry that none of us can ever match. But we're all more literate than, say, as a society than Europe was, say, 500 years ago. So we can aim to increase the general level of wisdom among our population. And this is, of course, a very old idea. This is from, say, an Inuit, sort of an autoethnography, we could say, by Betsy Anahatak. And she talks about silatunik as a kind of core value for the Inuit, a respectful state of being in the world. But that includes obedience, helpfulness, being observant and attentive, self-disciplined, interactive. And that's really what it means to be mature. And her claim is that this is the older Inuit education before they became much more integrated into the modern world, aimed for this type of education and this type of person. How to do that? Well, if you look at, say, social and emotional learning is already very prominent in the school system. We have many programs. So a review that was done by Stephanie Jones and colleagues out of Harvard proposed 5 skill domains: cognitive skills, emotional skills, interpersonal skills. And I guess related to that, character development and general mindset or motivation. And you find that there are things that can be trained: attention control, working memory, inhibitory control, flexibility. These are all things that can be cultivated. Likewise for emotional skills, emotional knowledge, but say emotional behavior regulation, empathy and perspective taking, and just general social understanding, conflict resolution, pro-social behavior. Those are all things that can be and are actually taught in the schools today in North America, and I'm sure in Europe as well. And through a variety of things. So not merely writing or sort of like argument, but role-playing, games, arts, creative projects, even creating songs and videos. These are all ways that students can be brought to consider these ideas. And of course, this is not a new idea. John Comenius, say, about 400 years ago, proposed that public education should be an education for wisdom. And I really love the way he frames this, which is just as a living body increases in size without any straining or forcible extension of the limbs, so too nutriment care and exercise, prudently applied to the mind, lead it naturally to develop wisdom, virtue, and piety. We don't have to force this. We can simply give people the opportunity to cultivate it and develop it. And we see examples of this type of education, although now they're considered alternative education, in things like the Equinox School in Toronto, that's built around the principles of John Miller. So he proposed that 6 types of connections, 3 more external, 3 more internal to the individual. Subject connections in which you cultivate multidisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity or even transdisciplinary projects. Earth connections, in which you really experience your connection to the earth and its processes through youth gardens. Community connections, where you try to build a cohesive school community. That's true, both within classrooms, but also across ages. And consider social justice and the wider community. Thinking connections, where you connect various kinds of thinking, linear and analytic thinking, certainly, but also intuitive, synthetic thinking. Body-mind connections, where you address sometimes the disconnect that people feel between their body and mind by introducing students to yoga or other kinds of mindfulness practices, contemplative practices. And what he's calling soul connections, what it means is cultivating the student's inner life through visualization, dream work, meditation, journal writing. And there's a school of about 200 students now, founded in 2009, so over a decade ago, in Toronto. That's an example, but of course there are many other schools of this kind. Sometimes they're associated with yoga movements, like Yogananda has like schools that are meant to cultivate wisdom. And other alternative schools, Krishnamurti schools, Waldorf or Montessori, many of them share this aim of trying to cultivate wisdom as the ultimate aim of education. Now, of course, you might say, well, Bhutan is a tiny country, or as the United States and Canada, Europe, there are hundreds of millions of people, they're vast systems. So of course we need to expand our concern of this to things that are not just school-wide, but also district-wide or statewide. We might need federal policies, but still will always be the case that we're looking for short-term improvement in social and emotional skills, positive attitudes towards others, positive behavior and relationships. And it's been found in research, at least in America, that you get fewer conduct problems, less emotional distress, and even a better overall academic performance, which of course has a cascade of or domino effect towards other long-term outcomes, higher graduation rates, higher learning, healthy relationships, less say criminal activity, even more engaged citizens. This is what we're aiming for with all of these, say, with this type of education. Now, of course, as was said earlier, this won't apply to everybody. There are going to be, general education, of course, is very important, but there may be certain people that have very serious difficulties that they can't really, they need some special support to tackle, to handle. And so then we might need specialized services like dialectical behavior therapy or these other more contemplative therapies, like ACT and others, you might know them, that are, so they share a common idea that they're aiming. The reason why I picked dialectical behavior therapy is that they talk about the wise mind, which is really, I think, say, a wonderful sort of way to talk about it. It's an integration of the emotion mind, which is to say, your moods, feelings, urges, and your reasonable mind. It's more rational, task-focused, problem-focused, pragmatic. You want to integrate these two. And often it requires, as was said earlier, accepting things, accepting what you can't change, but also realizing that sometimes you're not so powerless. There are certain things you can do if you're open and sensitive and reflective on what your options are. And as was also said before, but just to reemphasize, of course, I'm not claiming that everyone's going to become a sage, like Gandhi or Einstein. There are people like that, of course, but they're, once in a generation, or sometimes once in several generations. But everyone can become wiser. At the very least, everyone can become more practically intelligent, more skillful in navigating the kinds of problems that they encounter in their life and improving the quality of their lives for themselves and other people around them. This is actually a model that's taken from Karami and Garamani as an Iranian conception of wisdom, but I think it applies, of course, very broadly too, to all, say, worldwide, to what we're talking about right now. So what are my final recommendations? I think our current self-understanding and political culture are not carved in stone, but constantly evolving to meet the needs of society. We don't know whether this COVID moment will be a turning point for better or for worse. So what can we do to nudge ourselves and our communities towards a post-crisis growth? I'm suggesting we can personally cultivate wisdom through a sense of mastery, openness, reflection, empathy, and emotional sensitivity. We can embed concern with gross domestic product into a broader concern with gross national happiness and promote G&H through education reform that aims to educate for wisdom. In so doing, we're enacting a communal and relational ethics and avoiding the dangers of protectionism, just as many ancient wisdom traditions urged us to do. Now, I don't pretend to know for sure what post-crisis growth should look like, but I'm glad this conference on global crisis allows us all the chance to debate this question. And so I'll stop there and we can move on to the next part of our discussion together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle, for a very broad-ranging talk. I really appreciated the way that you interwove clinical material, educational material, historical material, cultural material, philosophical material, a full-bodied talk. So I really appreciated that. So it's almost hard to come up with anything that you haven't touched on. It seems like you've thought about it all before. So I'm just going to start with some questions that I have, and I want to encourage the attendees to please send any questions that you have to the question and answer chat, and I'll look at that and ask Michel. So I'm just going to see if I can change the view here so we're both on. Does that work?
We are both on my screen.
Okay. I don't know if all three or four, but okay. It's kind of nice to see the both of us, I think. So, you know, one of the things that I kind of noted in your talk was really a tension between wisdom is something that's emergent and it just emerges naturally. I think that was in one of the quotes that you said, and that it will come, you know, be patient, it will come. Yet on the other hand, there seems to be a lot of activity that needs to be put forth to make sure that wisdom does emerge. So for instance, Osman, one of his issues was it's difficult to access for the average person. So I was wondering if you can flesh out this tension that I kind of see in your talk developing, that it will be emergent, yet on the other hand, it takes a lot of activity. You need to be agentic. It's not a passive process. And I wonder how you see that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and something that I'm struggling with too. I mean, as like Kamenia said, it seems as though if you just give people good food and chance to exercise, they should grow bigger and stronger. That's what we expect of children physically, and the same thing seems like it could work with education too. In other words, if you give people just interesting things to do, say where they get to learn, that they should also just naturally, and especially if it's in a more socio cultural sense in which you engage other people, you say, and you have a kind of community caring ethical orientation, you can just naturally cultivate this type of wisdom. And that's why I put in the Inuit example, because it seems as though that's what at least this person, Betty, seemed to be saying, that was her experience growing up. There's no formal schooling, but this was the general community sense of what type of education we wanted. And she felt that it was something that was very widespread. Although if anyone reads that paper, you'll see that her parents seem particularly like striking. But the thing is that it does seem that in some sense it can be spontaneous, but of course not everyone is going to have the same. It's similar to like what people have said about driving or getting a driver's license. You know, sure, if you just like drive around with an experienced driver, you could probably learn to drive, assuming that they're good drivers. You know, but if they're actually not good drivers, then you could get a lot of bad habits that could come out. So unfortunately, the reality is that even day to day and moment to moment, we don't all keep the same sort of level of caring and wisdom, even the best of us. So, and some people are, say, have much more problematic backgrounds, so that it's difficult, if maybe even impossible, for them to adopt this kind of a communal view that will cultivate wisdom. And so if we just let it go spontaneously, we might find that we replicate a lot of the past problems. So especially in a reform context, I think it would be important to set up conditions so that for students, it's a kind of shared experience that they're cultivating this kind of relational and communal ethics and along with critical thinking about problems that gives you, wisdom, and not simply rely on. So it could happen, but schools can help make sure that if, say, that it's more likely to happen in cases where it's, their life circumstances are more challenging. I guess that's the short answer.
So it sounds a little bit what you're saying So it's also a chance, it's not just individual wisdom, it's societal wisdom. Do you think there's certain cultures that are more wise or less wise? Or would that be even a way that you would think about it?
I mean, there are, I think when you look back to certain like cultural moments, like, say Greek, say Athens under Pericles and the Sung dynasty, like there are certain like moments where it seems as though a lot of very famous and great thinkers emerged all at the same time. Often they knew each other, so I think that there are, and actually with Islam, they had the House of Wisdom, so there are certain like certain contexts that really draw people of talent, cultivate that, and maybe have it as a model for wider society. I mean, I'm sure it's always been true that you get a range of people like, who are more or less wise. And Igor Grossman has made the point that I completely agree with, that it's better to think of it maybe as a kind of state people are in that has a certain probability. So, yeah, I mean, you could be 90% likely to behave wisely, but there's still going to be 10% of the time that you could do something that you could have thought could have gone better. But that's still better than people for whom it's 90% of the time it doesn't go well, and it's only 10% that it does, right? So, and I think certainly certain social conditions, even the expectations of people, the way they invite reflection, or even the kind of education, I'm sure, it makes a difference to how likely it is that people will respond wisely. And especially today, I really do think that the global crises we're confronting, the COVID moment, but global warming, as some people said, that it's just like a warm up for global warming, in the sense that the kinds of global disruption, say, that we're seeing here could really, say, tip in a way that we can't actually pull back if we don't get this under control. So I think it's a good warning for us to try and set up conditions that will help us respond more wisely as societies.
Great, thanks. So I have more I could ask, but I want to shift to some of the questions. So we have a comment here. Thank you for that great presentation. Due to other ways of being in the world, it seems difficult to give a general understanding of the concept wisdom. So if we hold this to be true, each society will define wisdom in its own image and subsequently give content to wisdom in different ways. What are your thoughts on this? I think in some ways you got into it already, but yeah.
No, I mean, I think that I struggled with this myself, and I have to say my original position was much more that each culture and each historical moment would define wisdom differently. And so in that sense, it's really more about understanding the way people themselves, what they mean by wisdom. That's the sort of research that I've done, is going to China, going to the Ukraine, and, Canada, the US, different countries, asking people, what do you mean, think of a moment you're wise, or who's wise and why are they wise, and trying to get their own understanding of what it means to be wise. And you do find certain differences, but they're more differences of emphasis, it turns out, than they are absolute differences, because there is a general consensus that wisdom should both deepen your understanding of reality and of what's important, and also help you navigate that more skillfully.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you can get figures like the Buddha or Muhammad or Socrates that seem like pan-historical and global. People can still look to them, and even if you don't agree with every single thing about their example, but they seem to exemplify a way of dealing with, say, experience that seems wise, and not just for that local community, but more broadly. But it's still true, I guess, to go speak to that, it is always true that I think we reflect back into those models, even what we most value. And so there's always room to sort of query them and query the interpretation of why they're wise. And so I think that's part of the interest, really, is to keep meditating on this. Like, what is it that we really do value as wise? Mm-hmm. And so now I'm actually working with Fenying Wang, for example, in China, and other people, say, in Europe, say that it's a dialogue across cultures, which I find very fruitful, because it expands my own sort of like ideas of what I might have thought wisdom could be about.
Right. Okay, so we have another comment here. Nice talk, but thought it, wondered where and maybe if Freud's notion of aggression fits in here. For instance, civilization and its discontent. Are we social, as social animals, evolved enough for this concept to emerge without a monastery?
No, great point. And that's why I put in Darshan Narvaez's framework, because I think that what her claim is that actually all of us can tip in both directions. You know, if suddenly we feel under threat and say that under attack, we will adopt a protectionist ethics, say, and it can lead to aggression and violence. On the other hand, if we flip, say, if we reframe things as an issue of community, of one where we can support and help each other, we will actually like tip into a relational ethics that's much more associated with the ancient wisdom traditions, as she herself also says. So I think that of course, no, there's a great possibility for aggression that's latent. And it's really about setting up the conditions that we won't go there. That's what I think. That's why I think education and other types of institutional reforms have that quality. I mean, even the court system, I mean, if someone kills your brother, your probably first spontaneous reaction might be to pick up a weapon and go kill them, but in ancient times, that is how it went. You have these vendettas that would go across generations. But if you've got a court system and you really believe that justice is served, then you can see that and say like, well, it's better then for everybody if we like work through this system. So I think that civilization, of course, I mean, for Freud, I think this aggression is always just below the surface, and it's a kind of veneer that that's put on top of it that makes it seem more civilized. But I like Darshan Narvaez's view better. It's more like there are options that are available to us, say biologically, from the way we've evolved, that conditions can help us cultivate one over the other.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking about the justice system, some of the First Nations or Indigenous peoples' systems of justice on restitution, rather than kind of Western notions. And would you see that as fitting into what you're saying?
No, definitely. I think that's very important. In fact, even this idea of releasing all nonviolent criminals, or prisoners, which is happening here in North America, and I imagine probably also in Europe too, because there's such a high risk that, like, an entrapped population that's in such close quarters that's overcrowded to begin with. I mean, it's just ripe for like spreading this disease. But then you also can ask the question, why? If you stole a loaf of bread, are you in prison? Like, maybe that's not like the right answer to this type of thing. And in fact, in Quebec, where I'm originally from, for the youth, it really was, they had great success with restorative justice, where if you, say as a teenager, you, I don't know, say smash someone's window and stole some jewelry, then you would have to go back to that person's house and help them repair something about the house, or do something like to like help sort of help that particular person. And of course, you want to say if people are extremely violent, that might be a dangerous thing to do. But for most cases, that it's not. It's actually really, it restores a sense of community of the actual people that you've stolen from, and it helps restore the community. So I think these types of things are an important alternative to prison. And it's exactly about reimagining what is it we're trying to accomplish here. To the extent that, see, and that if you consider this protectionist versus a relational mindset, it actually fits very nicely onto that too. Because if so-and-so is a threat, then what do we got to do? We've got to isolate them. We've got to lock them up somewhere so they don't go, they can't get around. If it's more relational, you can say, well, whatever possessed them to do that? And is there some way we can restore relationship with them and them to us, so that they don't want to actually do that, or if they really need something, someone else can help them. They don't have to like sort of resort to that. So that kind of more relational view, I think, is associated with wisdom traditions, and it extends to the justice system too. Like I picked the education system as one I know better, but I think that it would extend very well to the justice system as well.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question. No. Do you think that post-traumatic growth following the pandemic would help the general public become more or less compassionate towards people with depression, suicidal thoughts, or those who suffer from loneliness? And you're also thanked for your talk.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Actually, we're actually doing a study now, but it's just starting, where we're asking people what are they doing under conditions of like this physical distancing or social distancing? How are their life projects changed? And also, we're going to try and recontact them sort of 6 months from now or a year from now to see like what are they doing, how things have changed. And we're asking them questions about post-traumatic growth and personal meaning, wisdom. So I might be in a better position to answer that question later. But I mean, if I'm going to go with just my intuition would be yes, because I think that we can all feel sort of things that, as I said with this post-traumatic growth model, you're sort of pre-trauma self. Well, many people, their pre-trauma self is their self. They didn't have any traumas to speak of, right? So it's very hard for them to sort of identify with other people who have these very disruptive events. But now I think we've all experienced something where like everything about the world that you know has changed. And so it should make it more sympathetic. And I think we're even noticing that, at least I've been noticing that everyone's more on edge. Or there's things that even people who you know to be generally very friendly, they snap at you sometimes, and you feel as though there must be something that is, that would make you more sympathetic to other people who are struggling in even greater way.
Okay, I think kind of flowing from that question, we have another one that asks, what would be the relationship between post-traumatic growth and resilience, and how to understand that both concepts are widely used or even constructed in times of neoliberalism, which is in many senses a very brutal regime in terms of putting most of the responsibility on individuals and reducing state provisions to a minimum.
Yeah, I guess I would just challenge that in the sense that the resilience literature has many different conceptions of resilience. And in fact, the individual one, sometimes people even coin a special term, resiliency, just to make it mark it from the rest. So Michael Unger, for example, I really like, he's got a more social ecological view of resilience, which is to say that people who are resilient is not just about some inherent quality of them, they're like sort of like have stronger will or, sort of something like that, but really about the conditions under which they're living, so that you can actually change and support those conditions and the resilience will improve. He gives an example of somebody that needed to meet with, I think it was like 5 or 6 different social support agencies, like say, imagine you're going for one for food, one for medical, one for this, one for the children, one for you. All of that makes it very hard to actually get the maximum benefit out of that. And so there was a project in which they had a team effort. You would go to one place and you would meet all the people you needed to meet for different things. And of course, something like that will really help improve resilience of the people who are accessing that system. So I think it's always going to be a dialectic between, some people, of course, weather situations more easily than others for things about their personality or their background, or there are individual differences in that regard. In fact, it's been shown that you can have biological markers for a likelihood to fall into depression and things of that kind. But it's still the case that everybody, if they have the better support, will do better and will weather sort of like stronger shocks to their system. So I'm not sure if I got all of that question, but I think that resilience can actually extend in ways that go beyond this neoliberal way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. I think the next comment, I'm just going to read it, even if you haven't finished, because I think there's some overlap. And I just want to tell the attendees, I'm not saying your names because this goes on YouTube and I don't have permission to actually say your names aloud, so I'm not going to do that. So Michel, I really liked your talk, and with all advice you're offering, and I could wrap myself into them, but let me be provocative. How do you see your advice, namely to meditate, reflect, ruminate, and find wisdom deep inside of us and make use of the therapeutic tools available, how is it different or not from the tools offered by the, and this is in capitals, the self-help industry? So I think it kind of relates to the previous question to some extent.
You know, I think actually, and I thought of that too. I said, well, first of all, I guess we want to be careful of making everything about yourself, which is what I was saying also about resilience. And maybe I hope I didn't give that impression this talk, although I might tend to like edge that way if I'm not careful, but I really don't want to say that. In fact, I think it's much more important to think systemically. So education reform reforms the entire system, and the kinds of things you do in say that cultivate wisdom are not just meditating, journal writing, but also engaging with other students, working on team projects, or even just helping others in the community who are in need, things like that, service learning. These are all things that engage you with other people. That's why I thought like, say Miller's 6 connections are, they include connections to the community, connections to, you know, other people, other disciplines, but especially to others in the community, like both your local community and the broader community. And that I think actually might be different than the self-help literature, which is often just about making yourself feel better. I mean, it could actually, you could read it as something more like redemptive processing, or at least it could be taken that way. Meditate until you don't worry about it anymore, or say you realize that it wasn't all your fault. And those are all things that will actually not lead to increased wisdom. And also in terms of therapy.
Can I just jump in for a sec? Because it kind of goes to the next comment, which is exactly about what is resilience, is simple denial or dissociation. People who live lives of despair, who are seen as having coped well. So I think you're saying it's a little different.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is we need to be careful, because it is true that sometimes the way that actually what resilience is, how it's framed sort of socially and culturally in the broader narrative that we typically encounter, is one that sort of places everything on the individual. And but I think that this more relational view that Darshan Alvarez is advocating is one that, say, and that I would endorse too, is one that needs to consider the connections in the communities within which we're, say, operating, both locally but also even broadly, so that the world becomes its community. Of course, I mean, we're going to feel varying, say, degrees of connection to that community. I mean, you always feel more connected to your immediate family and your immediate neighbors, but at the same time, you can feel as though if you feel the world is one community and we're working on things together, that will actually very much change the sort of stance you have towards other actors, other sort of ways of, say, that people are responding to this, and even the kinds of solutions that are proposed. And I guess the other thing that I was thinking about that is that even in terms of therapy, you have, for example, with transdiagnostic cognitive behavioral therapy, things like behavioral experiments as a method, which is to say, go and do something, try something. You know, so if somebody says like, nobody likes me, you'd be like, well, have you talked to anybody? I mean, go and actually introduce yourself and you know, and say, invite someone for a coffee. Like that might be your mission for the week. And if it turns out they say, sure, why not? I'd love to do that. It helps sort of change your own understanding of yourself and what's possible. I think those types of behavioral experiments can also be ramped up to a much bigger scale in terms of sort of what socially is possible. So for example, we had a small scale, unfortunately it was canceled by the conservative government that came in, but the liberal government before us had a universal basic income experiment with a small number of people. And they were testing this, they were collecting data to see, is it the case that it really will keep them more out of poverty, say with less demand on social resources, if everyone is guaranteed this income. And so I think you can do experiments like that to try out, and alternative schools are a similar type of experiment. If you were to carefully document what's done and what effect it has, before you go whole scale, of course, nobody would say, well, let's just change everything because we're sure it's going to work. It'd be much better to try these small scale experiments, but but that are larger, not individual, but that involve these systems.
It's almost like I'm here, it's not self-care, it's community care.
Yeah, and of course, the communities are made up of selves. So that's the way in which, of course, there's going to be a certain kind of resonance to self-help, but it can't just be each. It's like everyone for themselves. We're all sort of like just trying to take care of ourselves and make ourselves feel better. I think that actually fundamentally is a kind of protectionist mindset, even if you don't like acknowledge it. That even in your own mind, you might not be thinking of it that way, but ultimately it turns out to be that way, because it's like you first, and then, let others fend for themselves. If you have extra, you can help them, but you're not thinking of it as a sort of globally or like a sort of community response. And I think something like the COVID-19 moment, it really invites this community mindset, because you really understand that no matter what I'm doing, if everyone doesn't sort of participate, we're all at a much higher risk. And if people even just don't sort of like distance out of ignorance or out of because they've got some wrong idea, then like they're putting themselves, say, in danger, but they're also endangering all the rest of us. But also that you need certain systems like medical systems that can just, it's remarkable how these systems can change on a dime, like hospitals. They can just go like, okay, as of now, enter emergency rooms. We're emptying them. We're setting up these alternative things. Like just, we've got a lot of money to put into it all of a sudden. So they can do rapid changes, or like the emptying the prisons to the extent that happens. It's something that can be done very quickly. So it shows that change is possible. And in that sense, it can be a hopeful message too.
Yeah, no, those are great examples. I'm just kind of thinking or looking at the a next question, which was that, for people that are trying to kind of affect this kind of wise community changes, do you think there's pushback? Because what kind of pushback do you see just because someone's wise or a community is wise? What are kind of the ramifications? I think I'm paraphrasing the question a little bit. How do you resist that, I think, is the question.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure that's true. We see that in the news, like that even the best initiatives, well, funding can be cut. Like, so for example, I just mentioned this, when the Conservative government, say, took power in Ontario, in Canada here, their first action was to cancel this universal basic income experiment, and also all of these sort of, green, say climate change fighting initiatives. Even though it cost them a lot of money, they spent actually tens of millions of dollars canceling these things, which, because it was really an ideological sort of position that we just don't want to do that. And of course, there's always a danger, especially in a system like this, in which every 4 years the government can change. So it can be hard to sustain, say, these things, and entrenched interests that have a lot of money behind them can definitely step in to try and undermine changes that are good communally but bad for them. So I think, or people just themselves, I mean, it's about the sort of habits that we have that we developed over a lifetime. Even for myself, like, plastic straws are terrible, but paper straws are just so annoying. It's like, at some level I feel as though, the tipping can be that you start to realize that you really need to like sort of change this, but there's still a kind of resistance to doing things that are, even when that it would be better overall. So, and I think that's true on a large scale, but I'm old enough to remember when organic food was considered impossible, to like deliver to like supermarkets, because I mean, it's just so expensive, and how would you do it? It's like there's such a small market for that. But when it becomes widely, say, sort of something that people want, lots of people want it, then suddenly it can be done. Like, if you're ready to pay more, then by all means it can be there. And that's kind of where we are now with organic food. But the same thing could apply to like other types of, alternatives that will help us, I think, live in ways that are wiser and more communally sensitive and friendly.
Okay, so we have another question here. So thanks for your thought-provoking talk, Michel. I'm curious as to whether your experience through wisdom research gives you any novel ideas as to the wisest path to maneuvering the difficult choice we face right now between saving lives immediately through, oh, this is a tough question, through the economic shutdown and possibly saving more through keeping the economy closed and saving lives. Where does wisdom fit into this question?
I think that it actually does fit very well, although I'm not going to pretend to know the answer. And I think actually, maybe the wisest response is that there are people who devote their lives to these sort of considering like these issues and getting them all together, sort of, and sharing their knowledge is probably the best way to do it. Because I've read many accounts that present this as it's a false dichotomy that in a sort of simplistic sort of either or choice between, let's say, shutting the economy down to save people who might get ill, or opening it up and some people are just naturally going to die from that. Because there are ways that, I mean, even physical distancing, for example, is a way in which people can move around. And if there's a way that, as some countries have done, like Taiwan and South Korea, they've been able to sort of trace, like, say, if you have a flare-up of an infection, trace where it came from and sort of who's been affected, and isolate those people. To the extent that you can do things like that, and I saw a report on Taiwan in which they, for example, someone lands at the airport, they give them a temperature test. If they have any sort of like risk associated with them, the government gives them a taxi, sends them to a particular like thing, and then they have an app on their phone that will trace their movements once they're out of quarantine. So all these types of things are systems that many different skill sets are needed to put into place. But when you have them, you can both return with more confidence to, like, say, the broader like economy. And if there is, say, someone who's ill, identify them much more quickly and then sort of like minimize the risk. You can't eliminate it completely, but you can minimize the risk that they'll infect many other people. And of course, there's certain very vulnerable people like, the frail and the elderly who might need special consideration to protect them. So I think there are ways in which you can like minimize harm, and if you're very skillful at it, you can open up the economy and still sort of not have a spike in a lot of deaths. It's just that if you just simply go with one or the other, you can cause a lot of suffering, I think, and that's part of the trouble because it requires more skill, more coordination. It's harder to do to actually account for all the variables that are in play, which is part of the reason I think we're in this situation we're in already, because certainly at first everyone thought they were tracking everybody that had this disease, but then they weren't, because you could spread it without symptoms, and then now suddenly there's lots of people. So I think that it's a very good question, and I guess the kind of like way I'm imagining, which is not me, but many other people have said this, that I think that if you try and do this in a sophisticated way that minimizes harm, but at the same time tracks like who has this illness, I think you can actually do both. But
I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit. It's just off of a comment or question that someone sent in. We've talked about post-traumatic growth and, the trauma of the COVID moment and the crisis, which is the theme of this whole conference. So if you can answer the question for the conference, that would be really great. But where is trauma? At least maybe in some of the models that you've spoken about or talked about or brought up.
Oh, sure, no, of course. In trauma, I mean, well, say Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, their whole model is post-traumatic growth. So I mean, and they're the ones who coined that term. And the idea that there's some event that's disruptive of your everyday sense of self and the way the world is and the way you can move through the world. If that's how you define trauma, then yes, trauma is everywhere. The whole thing is like one massive trauma, so I think that's true. Of course, it's still the case that people are more or less disruptive. I mean, there's some people, like, we could have this conference, say, over Zoom. We can say, and if you're working at the university, a lot of times you can still be doing not the exact work, but similar types of work. You're still getting a salary. Unlike someone who's, say, working at a in an airline, in which they go like, nobody's flying anymore. You're all going home, and that's it. So if you're like a baggage handler at an airport, I mean, that's pretty much it. Unless somebody steps in and specifically helps you, that can be a massive trauma. And I think this is what people are saying about, Denmark versus the US in terms of the way they're responding to this. It's like, my understanding with Denmark is that the government guaranteed 90% of salaries if businesses kept their employees. Well, something like that, it just puts everybody's mind at ease. You're like, you might have to cut back a little, but you feel as though we won't starve, and we're going to be, say, when things pick up, we should be able to get like our job back. Even if you don't, you have confidence if they're ready to do that, they could probably be ready to do something else that will help me. Whereas if I take the US as a contrast, just because it's such a striking like difference, it's that it's more, because it's more individualistic, I think. It's the idea is that, well, we'll just let everybody sort this out for themselves. And then if you're one of these people who's a baggage handler and you're laid off, and there's no guarantee that, you get a little extra benefit, a few $100s, a few $1,000s in support. But after that, what's going to happen? Like, just that could be very, very traumatic, because I think that it's the unknown that's the most traumatic part of it. In this model, the idea is that, by thinking about it, analyzing it, and seeing new possibilities, you can sort of reinvent yourself. And so in that sense, you can grow from that experience. But of course, it presupposes that you can actually do that. There will be a job that there's, say that you're, that there's something that you can do that will be, that will make that possible. Conditions will be in place that will make that possible. And if it doesn't seem like that's for sure, that I think would be extremely like anxiety provoking. And we know that there are tens of millions of people that are out of work now. Many of them, I'm sure, say it's a much higher level of trauma.
Do you think I was just listening to what you're saying about the baggage handler at the airport. So just going back to the level of the individual, do you think we all have equal opportunities to develop wisdom? Is it an option for everybody?
Well, there's different ways of, like, we're doing a project on wisdom from adversity. It's a book project, but and actually Melanie Monroe is doing a thesis on this topic too, so she's almost done. But the idea of that is that there are different ways. There's some things, so similar to a mastery orientation, that the wisdom that you can gain from the situation is in the way you respond to it. And so in that sense, we can all gain wisdom from experiences. But of course, sometimes the wisdom is in what you can do to make it better. But other times the wisdom is just to accept that there's nothing you can do. But actually, like, being anxious about it is not helping. It's not gaining you anything. So Michael Linden has this post-embitterment wisdom therapy, which I really think is marvelous, because that seems to be, it works with real problems where people feel life has not treated them fairly and they're very bitter about it. But usually half their problem is that they think that it shouldn't be that way, and it's other people's fault that they're in this problem, which of course is one framing of the situation. But another framing of it is that that's just how it is. So, you just need to accept that there's nothing that you can do. So, and I think that that stance lets you then become more open to what other possibilities are available to you, or at least whatever they are, even say if they're small. And so I think that in that sense, everyone can gain wisdom, can navigate these things wisely, but not always to equal success with, say, a happy outcome, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Something to reflect on. So I have our last question of the day, and it's a wonderful question because it says, in your daily life, what wisdom helps you navigate this crisis?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so I don't know if I have any special wisdom, but even though I'm studying this, but I guess that there is something about, for example, I mean, I've been finding it stressful that I have a son who's 8 years old and he's not in school. And so he really wants to be basically doing things all the time, so which often involve, him being outside, biking around, but he's too little to just let him out and like sort of no supervision. So I spend a lot of time just like outdoors watching, making sure everything's okay. And then sometimes I get frustrated that, well, I'm not actually getting any work done here. Like, I mean, like, the whole day can go by and I'm going to be like, well, I'll just have to do something at like 9 o'clock at night. I'm going to start on like around 2, but by then I don't have the same freshness. But at the same time, there's something fun about being out and like sort of being outside, seeing not only him, but other kids, like sort of, being kids. So I think the wisdom is trying to like gain something from a value from the experiences that are available to me and not stressing and maybe in the embitterment, like sort of like say mindset, not being bitter about the things that I'm not able to do when it seems to me that they're just not possible under these circumstances. So, and just remaining hopeful that in the end, it will be something that it'll be a memory to come back to, certainly, and it'll be something that does teach me something important, no matter how it plays out. So I guess that's about the smallest that I've got, but it's small, but that's what I'm working with.
Well, and those wise words, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the conference community for your talk, your thought-provoking talk. I think it's going to stimulate a lot of reflections on the way we live on our everyday level and the way we think of our relationship with the communities that we're in and how to move forward in this period of crisis and maybe use it as a step to live more wisely. So thank you very much, Michel.
Well, thanks you for this conference and for inviting me and for all the questions too. It's really wonderful to have a chance to talk with everyone about it.